Thank you. You mean you didn't get all of that? Anyway,
start from.
I got to start from the beginning, damn it. All right. And anyway, and so you know, Elon Musk is now the richest person in the world, and now every car company in the world wants to build electric cars. And most of the large car companies have actually said things that by 2030, 2035, they're not going to produce internal combustion engines anymore. And why are they doing this? Is it because they love green? No, they don't love green. They want that share price that Elon Musk has, right? And that, I think, is kind of the apocryphal case for the other side. So the end point of that one is instead of 5 degrees centigrade, I think they're talking more like 2 or 3 by 2010. And now I think I'm going to leave it to our panelists to tell us which side of this they land on. I think I know where they mostly land, but I think we'll let our panelists come in and give us their positions on this larger debate about, is capitalism save itself or is it doomed? And let's go ahead and start with Benjamin Braun from the Max Planck Institute.
You didn't really tell us that was the question until just now.
You should have asked that before. So you can say something.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you for inviting me to speak on these big questions. So obviously, it's a very big question, climate change and the future of capitalism. I am far from being the biggest expert on climate change in this room, and so also I can't really see into the future. So I will kind of stick to what I know, but it does fortunately apply to the question. So the present of capitalism and financial capitalism and asset management capitalism in particular. There is another angle on this that I could have taken. There's ongoing work I'm doing with Daniela Gabor on green macro-financial regimes. But that's tomorrow. So you're all welcome to that. So today I want to speak to the question, why will finance and thereby capitalism, here's the answer, not deliver the green transition? I will try to answer present two questions. Who owns stranding assets and who owns assets more broadly? And in our economy, that means first and foremost corporate assets, shares. And then, well, these are the asset managers first and foremost, besides the Elon Musks. What's the politics of what I call actually existing asset management capitalism, as opposed to the dominant theory, I would say, in more optimistic corners of the corporate governance world, which is the universal ownership theory of this new iteration of shareholder value capitalism. All right, so the simple answer is that the same actors who own other assets own stranding assets, and I just extracted this afternoon from the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Data Book. This data, which shows you financial wealth and net wealth, the distribution since 2000, it hasn't changed much across the globe, and obviously wealth is extremely concentrated. You know the Piketty kind of data here. I show you the regional distribution in the world, and most financial wealth is concentrated in North America and Europe, and China is growing, of course. But so that's the most macro way of looking at this, and now I'm going to break this down a little bit for you. Here is an extremely interesting paper that many of you, I'm sure, have seen because it's made the rounds by Gregor Semienyuk and others, which came out in Nature Climate Change. And they did an analysis of 44,000 oil and gas fields in the world. Who owns them? So stage one, the first bar is where are they located, these oil and gas fields? And you can see that 40% in the OECD world and 60% in the rest. Stage two is where are the headquarters of the companies that own these oil and gas fields located, and which of these are listed and unlisted. So then you see the biggest pie is listed companies in the OECD world. Much of this is owned by finance and investment funds, of course, and then also non-financial corporations. In stage 4, that's the ultimate owners, which are, of course, the ultimate owners are always households in a way, unless something is state-owned, then it is the state. Creditors just means that these are basically insolvent or balance sheet insolvent. I think it's not entirely clear in the paper entities. So we are going to look at this layer, especially because it's kind of trivial that the ultimate beneficial owners have to be households or states. So who are the holders of corporate shares? Here I show you some data that is based on an analysis done by some OECD economists a few years ago. And you see that listed corporations are held overwhelmingly in the US and the UK, also in other advanced economies by institutional investors. And yeah, this is especially prevalent, of course, in the UK and the United States. Now I want to talk about these institutional investors. And here I show you the investment. I should speak close to the microphone. The investment chain, institutional investors, that's pension funds, endowments, sovereign wealth funds. But increasingly over the last few decades, these investors, these asset owners, have delegated asset management to these asset management firms that I've been studying, so mutual funds, firms that offer mutual funds, ETFs, exchange traded funds, but also hedge funds and so on. But I will talk about these plain vanilla asset managers such as BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, the so-called Big Three, who in the US today are the dominant shareholders, and together, according to this latest data just published by these three authors as a working paper in 2020, own staggering 23% in the average S&P 500 company in the United States, which is above the habitual level of control that is used in the comparative corporate governance literature. So as a group, the Big Three are close to having controlling stake in every single listed firm, except this is, of course, less meaningful in a company like Tesla or Amazon that's majority owned by a founder, owner, or a family. But these firms, the point is, we used to think about US capitalism as a paradigmatic dispersed ownership society. And this has completely changed over the last 15 years. And the US, in a way, in terms of institutional ownership is nowhere more concentrated than in the US, and is the second most concentrated in the UK. And of course, individual ownership is still very concentrated in other countries, but the US have found a way towards a very concentrated ownership structure that was not widely expected as recently as 15 years ago. Now, I can see the top here anyway. Now on to the politics of actually existing asset manager capitalism. Here I show you a table that the source is shown here, which is a chapter that you can find online in the American Political Economy volume. And the point of this is to show this unusual return to a highly concentrated ownership structure under asset manager capitalism. But these owners are fundamentally different from any previous, say, shareholders. We don't want to call shareholders owners of the corporation. They're owners of shares only. We don't want to call them owners of firms, at least. Anyway, these shareholders, unlike what's unique about this configuration is that these shareholders are fully diversified. at the same time own 10% in every single corporation. And that creates a very different set of theoretical questions. And the theory that I mentioned at the beginning, and it's not Madison Condon, a legal scholar, and Jan Fichte and Ilke Heemskerk, who worked on this from this very university here. They don't defend this theory, but they have written on it and explained the logic in law and political economy. The promise of universal ownership has been known for many years, and it is that diversified shareholders should, in theory, internalize all negative external effects across all corporations in their portfolios. And since their portfolios are universal portfolios, basically a universal planetary problem such as climate change, which is going to affect presumably the ability of these companies to be profitable in the future, these universal shareholders should act aggressively, use their power, which they no doubt undoubtedly have, with 10% ownership stakes in 23 as a group, and that's just the top 3. There are many others, in order to do something about this problem. And there's a lot of debate and a lot of empirical literature that studies the effect at the firm level of ownership by the big 3. But I don't want to go into that today. I want to suggest that we don't really need detailed empirical analysis to at least say that in practice, the rise of the big 3 and of asset manager capitalism as a configuration has coincided with rising payouts to shareholders, with rising executive remuneration, and with the massive shortfall in green investment and decarbonization that has brought us all to this room today. So that's the premise for, and I want to offer just one potential, or one way of rationalizing this, other than saying, well, it's fine, it's bad. Asset managers, what do they want? This is, I think it's extremely important, unlike with, these are not asset owners, pension funds, endowments are asset owners. These are asset managers, for-profit businesses. They want 2 things. They want to maximize their assets under management, and they want to minimize political and regulatory risk. Because for BlackRock and Vanguard, they're pretty firmly in the lead, and they're continuing to grow. And the biggest risk, in my view, is their business model is political, in the US especially. Dominance in the field of corporate governance is not part of their business model. It's a political, it's a historical accident in a way, and it has become a political liability for these firms. When they exercise voice, which is the main concept in the corporate governance literature, they address not only portfolio companies' management, which is the usual assumption, but also prospective clients, regulators, politicians, and their voters. So I'm proposing a kind of political theory of asset manager capitalism. And I think that the concept, okay, I'll stop in 2 minutes, or 3 minutes, this was 12. The concept of organizational hypocrisy that comes from organizational sociology, I think is very helpful here, even though, one could work with voice, which is the exit, voice, and loyalty, the Hirschman triad, and voice is the conventional concept, and he proposed this as a essentially political mechanism, as opposed to exit, which is a paternalistic form of action. But I think it is too loaded with a different meaning in the corporate governance literature, and I think we need a more robust concept. And the way Braun defines this, to talk in a way that satisfies one demand, to decide in a way that satisfies another, and to supply products in a way that satisfies a third. I mean, there's no coincidence that this concept has been used in the corporate social responsibility literature, for example, and this is a very similar case. And yes, the main point that I want to get across is that asset managers are always engaged in three fields at the same time. And in the order of importance, in my view, those are the market for asset management services in which they compete, regulatory politics, simply, and then corporate governance. I have some examples here that we can maybe talk about more in the Q&A about just some dramatic examples that back up this claim that the big three have not been at the forefront of green investment or bringing down carbon or greenhouse gas emissions. They haven't voted. They have been talking the talk, but they haven't voted accordingly. They haven't voted their shares accordingly. Very interestingly, they kind of have in Europe, but they have, or at least they have voted in favor of shareholder resolutions, environmental ones in Europe, but absolutely not in the US. And I think this is an extremely important data point. Here I show you something quite puzzling. BlackRock last year had started an initiative that is still live and growing. Calls it voting choice. This is the white paper they published with it, and it's about allowing institutional investors to tell BlackRock how to vote the shares that are associated with these institutional investors' holdings of BlackRock funds. Whereas in the past, asset managers always cast the votes themselves. And so why would financial giants give up the biggest resource or foundation of their structural power, which is these votes that they have? Supposedly, if they are universal owners and want to do something, as universal owners, then they need those votes. They cannot exit. They don't have exit options because they're indexed and they're too large. They need the votes. Well, in May 2020, this year, a bunch of Republican senators introduced this Index Act, Investor Democracy Easily Expected, which would basically force asset managers to consult each and every single investor for how to, which would be extremely costly for them and is probably not going to be enacted. But this this example is only the latest step of escalation in a war, or let's say that illustrates this fact that big three are too big to escape politics, in my view. We are in a world where these financial actors, essentially all the conflicts in American politics can play out in their business models. There are tax and pension funds and Californian pension funds and so on. And they get attacked from left and right. We're back to politics. That's why I think these actors deliver. Thank you.
Do you guys need to switch to slides? Do you need to use it all?
Oh, it's all set.
It's all set? Okay. Okay. So, Tim Brownlee will talk now.
So thanks, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. Thanks for being here. The collective brain power in this room, just from the few faces that I recognize, is really impressive. So it's really an honor to be asked to speak to these kinds of big questions. But it's also caused me to kind of bang my head against the wall for the last week in trying to figure out what it is that I want to say. In part because recent events seem catastrophic everywhere you look. So in the US, of course, the Supreme Court has gutted the EPA's rulemaking authority, and this is one of just several distressing decisions by the far-right court, which kind of institutionalizes the Trump administration's anti-regulatory agenda. The Amazon rainforest is burning at a faster rate this year than in previous years. Even something like methane emissions, which in my view should be a problem that really can be tackled because it's a problem of waste. It's a problem of mostly of natural gas wells not being properly monitored and kept. And this is a politically, I think, solvable problem. Everyone wants to reduce waste. It's concentrated in a few key sites, and yet this problem has gotten worse in recent over the past year, in part because there's a race to produce more natural gas in response to sanctions against Russia. Germany is firing up coal-fired power plants again. And of course, the decrease in carbon emissions that happened with the COVID pandemic has rebounded, and in some cases gone even beyond what it had been in the previous years. Even the bright spots that I tried to think of are a little depressing. So per capita beef consumption in the US is down since the early 2000s. And black bean consumption and chickpea consumption is up. But beef consumption has actually dipped back up just in the past few years in the US. And globally, of course, it continues to rise. China recently announced that it will no longer finance the building of coal-fired power plants abroad. But domestically, they're producing more coal than ever before. And now coal production is increasing in places like Indonesia, again, in response to price changes occurring because of events in Russia and Ukraine. So, what I ultimately decided is that we can't get very far in just thinking about current events, and we should try to think about somewhat longer-term trends. As a sociologist, I'm better at thinking of trends that happen over decades rather than millennia. At least I'm the sort of sociologist that's better at thinking about trends that happen over decades rather than millennia. So what I want to do is just tell you about a few things that I think are occurring, some of which I've done research on, some of which are a bit more speculative, that may have some bearing on where global capitalism is going. First, I think there is at least a partial fracturing and division in the transnational capitalist class, although Benjamin's evidence maybe points to some other dynamics as well. So clearly, national rivalries have fractured the transnational capitalist class to the extent that it ever existed. And there are new rivalries and new divisions around climate. So Jeff Colgan, Jessica Green, and Tom Hale have this nice paper where they talk about the potential conflicts, maybe not actual yet, but potential conflicts between holders of so-called climate forcing assets, fossil fuel companies, and holders of so-called climate vulnerable assets, holders of coastal property and insurance companies, as a sort of new and salient divide in the capitalist class. I would add that there are lots of holders of sort of climate indeterminate assets, mining companies, media companies, retail companies, and much depends on which way they go. That is, which of these two other segments they end up aligning with. I don't have any predictions about this, but I think this is one of the big questions we ought to be thinking about. Second, I think there's a crisis in the global neoliberal project that predates Trump, predates COVID, predates the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So Kristen Hopewell, among others, has argued that the crisis of relevance and capacity for the WTO really happened before the Trump administration and reflected conflicts over the rise of China and other new powers. In China in particular, it turned out to be pretty good at working within the WTO system, leading to this breakdown of US involvement in the WTO that has crippled it. There's also been, I think, the rise of industrial policy that directly contradicts many of the tenets of the neoliberal model of having a small night watchman state. So again, I don't have a prediction, but I think the big question we ought to be asking here is, which way is the neoliberal project going, and which way are the global institutions created to support the neoliberal project likely to go? One path is a kind of path toward green industrial policy, in which there's new space and newly legitimated space for planning and certain kinds of subsidies if they have tangible climate benefits. On the other hand, I think there's a real potential for a reinvention of neoliberalism through a green lens. That is, the crisis of neoliberalism might be resolved by creating a new kind of green neoliberalism that promotes trade and freer trade in environmental goods and services, and a fusion of environmental and anti-subsidy rules as a future for the global economy. And here I just want to mention the WTO's recent decision on illegal fishing, which I think illustrates the ways in which an argument against subsidies, a neoliberal argument against subsidies, and an environmental argument against overfishing were fused, ultimately in a way that allowed the WTO to take action. Third, and this is where I've actually done some research. Global supply chains aren't going away, but they're changing in a variety of ways, both in their structure and in their regulation. So on one hand, it's clear that COVID exposed the vulnerabilities of a world of lean and mean global supply chains. And it's clear that there are also strong political pressures for reshoring and a kind of renationalization of production, not only in places like the US, but also in China, as the Chinese government tries to promote greater self-sufficiency in high-tech fields in particular. So these would lead one to think that global supply chains are maybe a thing of the past, or that we'll see a great deal of reshoring. On the other hand, technological change has allowed transaction costs to get ever closer to zero, such that the classic make or buy decision is almost always answered in terms of buying, and in terms of contracting and subcontracting and subcontracting. There's been a revolution of modularity in global supply chains, making ever more pieces of a product interchangeable through well-specified standards. And I think there's also evidence that in spite of all the rhetoric of reshoring and renationalization, there continues to be a high degree of interdependence within some global supply chains. So Mark Dallas put together actually really nice testimony to the US Congressional Committee recently, showing that in spite of the trade war between US and China, when you look at mobile communications devices, you still see a really high rate of interdependence that will prevent a kind of radical decoupling of the Chinese and American economies in at least the short-term future. But not everything is staying the same. The world of global supply chains that we learned about in the early 2000s has clearly changed, and I just want to mention one way, which is the rise of so-called South-South trade. So we learned about global supply chains, global value chains, global commodity chains, global production networks, primarily at a time when we had producers in the global South exporting to consumers and retailers in the global North, and that's no longer the case. And South-South trade has really overtaken global supply chains, particularly for agricultural commodities like soy and palm oil, but increasingly for more complex products as well. There's also a wave of increased regulation of global supply chains, and now we finally get to where I've actually done some empirical research. So this is a graph from an article that Matt Amengual and I published just recently in the American Sociological Review on the rise of state intervention and perceptions of state intervention in global supply chains. And one of the things we do is to chart the increased use, the increased enforcement by the US government and of provisions against forced labor and provisions against international environmental crime. These clearly have increased from the 1990s and even the early 2000s. And you also see an increased prevalence of labor and environmental standards in trade agreements. So the world that I've studied for the past two decades, I guess that's right, has been one of private regulation, in which the task of dealing with exploitation and environmental degradation in distant locations and global supply chains has been left to the private sector in the form of corporate responsibility and corporate sustainability. That is changing as governments get more involved, not only through the kinds of cases that we chart here, but also through so-called due diligence, corporate environmental and human rights due diligence legislation that's being adopted in Europe, and the recent enactment of a law in the US that actually presumes that all goods coming from the Xinjiang region of China are made with forced labor, unless, and therefore banned from sale in the US unless the buyers can prove otherwise. And just as a side note, this is a bit of a challenge for the solar industry, which relies heavily on the Xinjiang region. The bulk of this paper is actually looking at public perceptions of this, using a survey experiment in which we show people a variety of different problems that might be encountered in the production of clothing, electronics, or seafood. And I just want to show one set of the results here, which suggests that the extent to which, and this is done in the US, we've since done a similar version in Germany, but the extent to which ordinary people think that it's okay and even useful to ban products from being sold in the US because of objectionable activities elsewhere in the global supply chain depends a lot on the particular problem. Where things like child labor and forced labor generate a high degree of support for this kind of state intervention, but maybe surprisingly, things like toxic emissions and overuse of, pollution of rivers and oceans, not overuse of natural resources actually, also generate high levels of interest in this. We explicitly didn't ask about climate change here because we didn't want the whole survey to be read through a partisan climate change angle. But I do think the findings have some implication for how at least some aspects of climate change might be framed around emissions and pollution in ways that create new discourses and new frames that maybe tap into public concern that hasn't been tapped into as effectively. So the question, of course, is what does all this amount to? Oh, by the way, lots of other things I thought I should talk about but didn't know what to say. Our lives are becoming training data for AI, which is feeding into automation, which is likely to displace lots of workers, maybe with productivity gains or without sufficient productivity gains. And of course, the war in the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its future carries lots of implications for economic fracturing and also political alignments and their future. I have no idea where this is going. So this is the question that we're all wondering about is, as we think about a variety of intersecting trends, how is it all likely to come together? That is, which paths are likely to be taken here and which are likely to be left behind? Are we moving toward green industrial policy or green neoliberalism? Are we moving toward fragmented supply chains or reinvented smooth supply chains? I think the received wisdom from economic sociologists and comparative political economy scholars is that the path that's chosen depends on some combination of efficiency, power, and politics, including both the courts and social movements. And so we've learned that a lot of these things are contingent and paths depend on the particular configuration of power and politics at the moment, during constitutive moments, with some paths are taken and others are abandoned. And it occurs to me that one of the big questions for a group like this one is whether climate change is an independent variable here or only a dependent variable. That is, one way of bringing climate change in is to ask whether it might also make a contribution to deciding which path global capitalism is likely to take. After all, we're talking about changes that will affect the distribution of land and agriculture, displace many populations. And so if we're really serious about climate change as a problem, we ought to think about whether it constitutes an important independent variable in this question about global capitalism or merely a dependent variable. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us this evening. My name is Simone Pulver. I'm an associate professor of environmental studies. And Neil, you set me up perfectly at the beginning. So thank you very much. So I use this image, and it's courtesy of the Ecological Footprint Network and a course that I teach on economy and the environment to introduce the fundamental dilemma of the course. Right? The x-axis depicts years, the y-axis depicts the number of planet Earth it takes to sustain global consumption and absorb global waste produced. Now, we are here somewhere, we are heading here, and we would like to be here, right? That's the sort of basic setup. And I would argue that this diagram is also a basic summary of the world's climate problem. Although it's worth acknowledging that the climate dilemma, or the sort of this larger problem about environmental sustainability, predates and actually extends beyond concerns about climate change. We are also pushing or exceeding boundaries of planetary carrying capacity related to nitrogen flows, phosphorus flows, land system change, a whole other set of issues of environmental concern. And I also want to note that while I'm using the pronoun we, the drivers of this trajectory are specific organizations and individuals who have also reaped the benefits of this trajectory while pushing the costs onto others. So there are two main schools of thought about getting off this trajectory and moving toward, let's call it a 1.5 degree C world. Pathway one, as Neil sort of set me up beautifully, is an evolution of capitalism, premised on the ability of capitalism to transform itself in the direction of regeneration, environmental protection. Environmental sociologists would call this trajectory ecological modernization, but it also aligns with the idea of green growth, industrial ecology, sustainable development, et cetera, et cetera. So that's pathway one, right, to get to the 1.5 degree world. Pathway two is essentially a radical break, a rejection of capitalism as a way to organize economic life. And I think the papers that have been part of this mini conference on the political economy of climate change tend to align with one of these perspectives, right? Those in the first camp are looking at capitalism as it currently is and are looking for signs of hope that the system can change and is changing. Over the past 2 days, and also tomorrow, let's not forget about the presenters then, we've already heard fascinating presentations about corporate environmentalism, about political windows that have enabled meaningful climate change legislation, creative proposals about how to meet the green transition investment gap, the embracing of the idea of climate risk by central banks and other financial actors, right? These are all folks who are looking at the current system and seeing the sort of potential in that system and the potential directions it might move. I think of this as analyzing the leading green edge of capitalism. So those in the second camp, for thinking about how do you get off this trajectory and reject sort of capitalism as a means to get there, really envision what a climate just economy and society might look like. And I'm going to reference my colleague at UCSB, David Pello, an environmental justice scholar, who describes the 4 pillars of critical climate justice as 1, recognizing multiple axes of difference, 2, a multi-scalar approach that recognizes how spatially disparate global north and global south communities, economies, and environments are linked to each other through historical and contemporary exploitative relationships, as well as how those relationships have actually shaped global change. The third pillar of a critical environmental climate justice is both anti-capitalism and an abolition of the state orientation, right? Both of those are institutions and agents that need to be gone for true climate justice. And then finally, a commitment to indispensability, right? The current system considers lots of people, lots of places as dispensable, and so climate justice is a commitment to indispensability. Now, these ideas of climate justice can be found in the rhetoric and practice of global climate justice movements, and were present in our sessions, I think, in justice-based critiques of the business of adaptation in the global north and south, for example, in analyses of, or at least at minimum, procedural justice in some global climate funds, and I think in the Q&A sessions that spotlighted the consequences, for example, for labor of decommissioning coal or moving away from coal. So these two schools of thought, the green capitalism and the climate justice, or the schools of thought, often exist in parallel universes. But I think the dialogue and disagreement between these two camps can actually be very generative. So work on climate justice is critiqued for lacking a theory of transition. How do you get there from here? right? We can envision what the future should look like, but how do you actually get there? There are certainly some communities that live according to these principles of climate justice. I think a lot of research in indigenous communities is sort of built around that idea, or seek to live them, but there are really no examples of this operating at any kind of larger scale. Another critique is that climate justice has been a core theme of the global climate movement since at least 2000, if not before then, and yet what has all that activism achieved, right? There's a lot of rhetoric, but sort of what's the sort of tangible outcome? Likewise, the greening capitalism school of thought is critiqued from a climate justice perspective for its false assumptions about the potential of efficiency improvements to actually generate a decoupling of environmental harm from economic growth, for the symbolic nature of a lot of climate action, for the lack of real concrete evidence of change from corporate and state-led initiatives. Yes, we have a Paris Agreement, but emissions are nowhere near on track for a 1.5 or a 2 degree world. Big polluters have been grappling with climate change for 30 plus years, and yet emissions declines have been marginal. So there's a lot of talk, very little concrete evidence of real change. Another example, which I gave earlier, but 25% of global emissions are covered by some sort of carbon pricing, but most of those prices are essentially too low to affect significant emissions reductions. And so I think there's a lot to be learned from this critique, or the engagement between these two perspectives. I would also argue that despite the differences and this culture of mutual critique, the two schools of thought share the same dilemma. One school builds forward from what is. I think that's the arrow leaving the trajectory that we're currently on. The other school tries to build backward from what could or should be, but neither approach really has any idea about the steps in the middle, right? Like, we don't know about that middle piece of the transition, right? We know where we are, we know where we might want to go, but that middle piece is an unknown. And I actually would also argue that there's a really productive shared research agenda across the two schools of thought that focuses neither on that leading green edge, nor on visions of what should be, but frankly on the dirtiest part of our current system, right? Dirtiest from the perspective of both climate change, but also the sort of social equity part of that. Because to me, it's those parts of the capitalist system that will determine climate futures, right? How will emissions reductions be affected in the US and in China in a timely way, given how much time we really have to address this issue? What leverage exists over Saudi Aramco and other Middle Eastern and state-owned oil companies, right? What leverage can we really exert over them? What leverage exists over the use of India and China's coal reserves? How do you upend what Theo LeCue calls carbon hegemony, an idea that the current incumbent system is protected by three levels: a level of sort of consent, we agree to carbon capitalism, serves us. But even if you disagree, you might be compliant with it because we're economically tied to carbon capitalism. And for those that both disagree and try to sort of break those economic ties, in the worst case, there's the coercion part of the hegemonic structure, the violent forcing of participation. So I recommend this research focus on these dirtiest parts of the system, not to denigrate research on that leading green edge. I actually think it's variation across states, firms, time that opens up ideas of what is possible, what might be. In a recent publication, I advocate for an approach to analyzing the variety of corporate and state environmental action and the implications of this variety for the limits, possibilities, and dynamics of system change, right? This shifts analytic focus from system tendencies, to include the ways in which, and this work focused specifically on corporations, vary in their interactions with society and nature, and the patterns, drivers, and consequences of that variation. And in that way, it reasserts the agency of corporations not as free from system constraints, but as actors who are both the products of and shape the systems in which they operate. Right, so I think, you know, when we're thinking about that sort of range, what the possibility, we should be thinking about it in the context of what does that help us understand about how we change those dirtiest parts of the system. And I will confess, especially in the late hours of the evening, that the dirtiest parts of the system seem immutable, right? In the darkest hours of the night. The only thing that I can envision filling that middle area, that question mark area, are the artificial sink technologies, direct air capture, other forms of carbon capture and storage and utilization, and more frightening, but also on the horizon, solar radiation management. It is perhaps this set of challenger technologies and companies that can unseat the current incumbents, but will not certainly unseat capitalism. Thank you.
So we got like a 10-minute late start, and I'm going to use my arbitrary authority and say we're going to get 7:45 in a minute. But I was going to say a few things, but actually you guys were great, and many of the things that I would have said you've all said. So why don't I open it up and let's start a discussion. Sure.
I'd like to suggest a way of transitioning by using a tax incentive for investors so they make a bigger profit quicker with less risk, on condition they change their corporate constitutions to give away 5% of their equity to the state voting stakeholders that elect politicians locally to approve the tax deduction, which will be self-financing because the tax base changes from low tax corporation to higher tax citizens. So you get a self-reinforcing political process to change the pyramids of power upside down, and you get, in 20 years, you've got 100% stakeholder-owned corporations, and you've turned corporations to meet the objectives of the Business Council of America to provide benefits for all stakeholders. So you've got stakeholder capitalism to do and become an agent for transitioning capitalism. It's remaking capitalism so it's bottom up rather than top down. Would you research and promote that with your political leaders, please? Because it's win-win. Win-win for the academics, it's win-win for the investors, it's win-win for the politicians that adopt it, and it's win-win for humanity, which is destined to be destroyed. And when we come out of our caves in a couple of hundred centuries' time, they need to have a plan for eternal sustainability of humanity. Otherwise, we're just an evolutionary experiment that failed, and it explains why you don't need aliens. We won't destroy ourselves.
Do anybody want to respond to that? I think, I don't know. Jeff? No? No. All right.
Why
So,
don't you respond? You're the leader.
I'm the leader. I'm the moderator. You know, I think, look, just off the top of my head, I'd just say that there are many, I think, policy things that are plausible that could matter in the long, middle run. And so your proposal was not it's something, if you could manage political support to produce such an outcome, that would work, or maybe it would work, right? But I think that's a different question than what we're kind of trying to do here today, which is a little bit like, I don't know. I mean, I think, I don't know, I really.
You want to research things rather than activate things.
Well, I think what your panel here is telling you is that I actually think there's a lot of ambiguity in what they're trying to tell you about what we do and what we don't know about how things work and how they might work and what might happen next. And I mean, I think everybody has a kind of stand But
You were a world leader in thinking about power change, so.
me personally,
Yes.
yeah. Putting me on the spot.
Of course.
What am I going to say? I don't know. I never think of myself that way. So it's actually true, I don't. And, I mean, you know, I think that there's lots of things that are going on that are slightly, that could matter more or mattering in the short run. I mean, I agree, for example, that, you know, like the oil companies' fallback position, they're like the cigarette companies, you know, who had a fallback position, had a fallback position, had a fallback position, and eventually got sued and, you know, and now they sell their product not in America anymore. And I think that the oil company's fallback position is carbon capture. I think that's what they're doing. I think they've made huge investments in it, and that's going to be their first fallback position. The first position was climate denial. Their second position was, oh, we're going to really be green, and a little bit what Tim said about what they're trying to do. And their third fallback position is carbon capture. And maybe if we can push them to their third position, that would be, and the faster that we get there, that might have some larger impact.
And if you're a politician, would you promote the idea of investing?
Oh, it's already happening. Those investments are already occurring. So.
I think we have to open it up
Changing
to
the power
a larger
structure.
group. Yeah.
Oh, changing the power. If I was a politician, I'm not a politician, but
That's part of the network initiative, is actually to
Make Neil
vote Neil into office. So
wait a second.
we're
Wait
gonna
a
discuss
second.
that. We're gonna discuss that later
We'll discuss
at
that
dinner. Yeah. So
yeah.
we open the floor.
So why don't you open the floor? Yeah, I think that's right. Let me let somebody else talk. I talked a little. Please go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you, Neil. So here's a question for all three presenters. I've noticed an interesting tension between the presentations by Ben and by Tim. It's a bit like portfolios do not give us hope, but T-shirts do. So, you know, BlackRock will not be effective at, you know, something climate change, but supply chains, under some conditions, there's reasons to hope that there's going to be change, etc. So the question I have is, why would it be that these two industries are creating such starkly different outcomes? Is it that they are just simply structurally different because of the intermediated nature of the asset managers, or what is it in your view? One possibility that I would like to explore is that a little bit like Tim was saying, the state regulation is not quite external to what BlackRock is confronting. They are, for instance, part of private self-regulatory schemes like the Glasgow Alliance. And so what role do you see there for financial actors to improve their act in the future?
So I can say something. I mean, it's not that I think that the story of increased regulation of global supply chains is necessarily that hopeful. But I think it signals a return of the state in a different, in ways that we ought to think about with regard to climate change. So it seems like at the same moment when domestic regulatory agendas within the US are being decimated, there's a lot of interest in regulating global supply chains across different parts of the political spectrum. And some of that's about China and a kind of nationalist politics about China that's clearly helped to push the forced labor regulation as far as it has. But I think some of that might just be a sort of not entirely tied up with nationalism, or at least with far-right nationalism, and might provide some opportunities to make supply chains a bit less carbon intensive and a bit more useful for transitions to renewable energy. However, the due diligence regulations, I think will probably empower many of the same actors that Ben's talking about, because it's all about companies kind of identifying and managing their risks. I don't think it necessarily requires companies to do things that differently. And so to some degree, it'll depend on how those votes go, right? The ESG votes that you talked about at the end, whether investors start thinking about the risks that companies are increasingly asked to disclose as really material to their investments or not. Maybe I was a little more hopeful until seeing your data on the ESG votes.
Yeah, maybe I say something very briefly also. I mean, the reason I did talk about these actors that are studied is not just because I happen to know about them, but because in the space of ideas about who is going to bring this about, you know, some people put a lot of hopes on central banks these days, others, and especially in the corporate governance world, on these shareholders. And maybe I should, and these are not, like, in my mind, other industries. These are other shareholders of corporations. And some people here have written about how shareholders in the US have basically completely transformed US capitalism once. So I should have maybe said this clearly before to just to make clear the power these shareholders hold in principle. And they've had the chance to do something on that scale, and there's just nothing that points in that direction. That was my
Give them a tax deduction.
absolutely.
Sure. Yes, it's a question for all. I begin by what Tim said, because I roughly take what you say, a division between inside the capitalist class, okay, but so good capitalist and bad capitalist, but they act all as an opportunity, climate change, an opportunity for margins and for more margins, inflation, etc., and for a trading scheme for emission of quota of emission, versus spending for human capabilities, because the invention of human being. So we come back to very traditional, but nexus of economy, spending for labor and human capacity, or spending for capital and investment. That's the first question. The second, you showed us opinions about climate in state. So could be good news. Is it a good news? Because it's state, so it's not firms and enterprises. So it brings me to Benji, because who will pay? Okay, there is that BlackRock, Big Three, etc. But create about monetary creation. It's our money, monetary creation, and that come to something of as a blind spot, which is the enterprise and what does the enterprise and the rights inside enterprise. I think maybe I would like to hear you that our society suffer of not doing that. Enterprise is a problem for the society itself. So not only relation between state and enterprises and another kind of relation between state and enterprises, but also the society powers or rights inside enterprises is a very important case, and only if this will be visible, then we tackle the question.
I can respond just, I mean, it's a more general response, which is to say, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not good at thinking across long historical time. So I tried to think about this in a matter of decades. And I think I don't see global capitalism changing dramatically over the next, say, 3 decades. But maybe there's space within the global capitalism of the next 3 decades to at least mitigate some of the potential damage of climate change. And that's why the things that are most on my mind are to what extent some companies will see a profit opportunity and really run with it in a way that actually diminishes carbon and methane emissions and mitigates some of the damage that's already been done or not, right? And so the broader kind of question about transforming capitalism or moving to an economy that's not about profit, it's about human capabilities, I'm all for that, but I over a 3-decade period, which is about as far as my little sociologist brain can manage.
But $1,000 billion
I don't see
from
it.
us,
Sorry?
$1,000 billion from us inside enterprises.
You're asking if I...
It's not past liberalism, it's neoliberalism, so with a lot of state intervention
Sure.
and state financing inside enterprises. And we don't ring the bell about the use of money, of public money.
So we only got like about 10 more minutes, so
Sorry.
I'm like, yeah. Let me, a question over here, I got a question over here. Why don't you, can be, let's be quick, please.
Today I was reading about floating hotels for 5,000 rich people. So it puts forward a kind of very dystopic view of the future of capitalism, where mechanisms for the uber wealthy, those that are well connected, survive. Everybody else kind of diminishes over time. And so my question really is a kind of dystopic view. How are we heading that direction? And then you have this also trajectory of repression, political repression that's going on in the world. So you have these two things of the economy heading in this direction and political repression. What about the intersection between the two? My second question is, what do you identify as the key points of inflection which are going to occur? I know you don't like to think ahead and stuff, but in which the opportunity will occur where we actually can begin to change things around. It's nice having straight lines, but how do you conceptualize these points of inflection that will create that opportunity to change the nation?
Well, I think it's good that you bring up the floating islands because there is I could you mentioned a disagreement or a difference between him and me, but I think there's also maybe a different perspective between Simone and me, which is that when we talk about the dirty edge versus the clean edge, this is in my mind not that simple. And I showed you the wealth. We do know about the carbon footprint across the wealth distribution, and I showed you where the wealth is concentrated. It's here, and it's in North America, and of course, the oil is all over the world, and there's Saudi Aramco and so on. But if we look for examples, and we should be talking more about industrial policy here, then the dirty edge is maybe also where the clean edge is, which is Chinese development of renewable industries, which is just insane by we've got nothing like this, and it's perfectly imaginable that in 10 years, firms like Saudi Aramco will be in trouble because there won't be, there will only be electric vehicles in China, and they will be 100% renewables. And they have done this via industrial policy. Of course, they're not a democracy, but they have done this via state-led industrial policy, which we heard something about in the conference. This just maybe as a counterpoint to where the dirty and the clean edges are.
I want to speak on this
Sure,
as well. So I guess one point I think we talk about sort of climate impacts, and I think one thing that I historically, as a society, as a global society, we do pretty well with ignoring suffering, and sort of things get really bad and it really makes no difference whatsoever. And I think that sort of collapse scenario is pretty way out, right? That's floating around. I agree that sort of, China's a really interesting case, right? Because of the sort of simultaneous investment in sort of dirty and clean technologies, right? But, when we're looking at what's been going on with Chinese emissions, they've been going up, they're going to continue to go up, right? Like in theory, maybe they're going to peak and then sort of go down, and they've taken on carbon intensity targets and nothing beyond that, right? So I think there's a lot of sort of potential projections. I doubt that in 10 years that all vehicles in China will be electric vehicles, right? Like I think there's a sort of hopefulness to that. But I do think that sort of, to me, the inflection points are in technology solutions, right? Like I think that's sort of where the inflection points are that sort of don't really sort of destabilize the fundamental power relationships, right? Big car companies are still big car companies, big energy companies are still big energy companies. And so the question is sort of which technologies become cost competitive when.
Now this conversation.
And they can't be scaled up rapidly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would actually like to have a counterpoint to this, because I think if we basically deal with the discussion, I mean, it's good to talk about climate change and capitalism, because of course the key aspect for the discussion is property rights. We have sort of like no chance of dealing with the consequences of capitalist development if we discuss property rights and the sort of like the claim on profitability sort of like only in these economic terms. And basically the solution to climate change in some kind of technical, technocratic sense, sort of like completely tries to get rid of the discussion of where are the property rights that are the cause of climate change, namely fossil fuels, namely the pollution connected to the production system, and in the past, progressive discussions how to overcome problems of social inequality and so on and so forth, of course, had a very clear understanding of decommodification, removing property rights, changing sort of like social arrangements, social structures, social institutions in ways to make compatible economic actions and basically well-being. Now, if we are always confined to discuss climate change related challenges in terms of sort of like maintaining capitalist social relations, that means we are not challenging property rights. We are remaining stuck in the system of green capitalism, of basically betting our hopes into modifications of capitalism without addressing the question who should actually remove property rights for fossil fuels, for other sort of like very dangerous and difficult things. In the past, I felt a little bit we should sometimes think in longer traditions, like in the sort of like causes and consequences of slavery, which was a very bad system, obviously, for many parts of the human society that was involved. And it took several civil wars and several sort of like very violent processes to remove it and change it into a system of commodification of labor. And then it took the trade union movement to decommodify labor for a little bit. And of course, now we have this neoliberalism, the recommodification of many aspects of the social relations. So I think the key aspect to not ignore that capitalism is about property rights. And of course, we have varieties of capitalism. So we can, depending on social movements, on social forces, on ideas about the future, we can decommodify vast areas of social life without completely removing capitalism. But that's, to my mind, a key question if we are willing and able to address the question of property rights, because, I mean, climate change will address it. I think Tim had the kind of conflict about the various sort of like positions of capitalists, those that want to preserve the property rights for fossil fuel production and destroy by that way, of course, a lot of property in all kinds of areas of the economy. And so last comment on this, that's the reason why this is really the kind of key question for neoliberalism, because neoliberals cannot resolve sort of like a future model of society without resolving their proposition of universal property rights. Climate change universalizes property rights, and therefore this is in fact a key crisis of a neoliberal approach, because it cannot sort of like be done without having a clear understanding of the redistribution of property rights. Who can continue to have property rights and who can't because of the consequences.
So I tell you what I'm going to do, because I got like 3 minutes. I got 2 hands from these people who've been watching us, and I thought, why don't we just let them make their comments, and then if there's any time, we'll go with it. But Matthias or Malcolm, do you want to come in and say something quick, or go ahead? Matthias, why don't you go first, since you're on my left and Malcolm's on my right. Go ahead, Matthias. You want to say, are we getting you?
Yep. Thank you very much. Really interesting discussion and great presentations. Thank you so much for making this accessible for people who cannot join in person. My question relates to the kind of a dynamic of division of labor that we see here in the room. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on climate change. That's the hot topic, and it's obviously really important. But capitalism is detached from the material reality, the earth we live on, in different dimensions as well. We have a decline in biodiversity. We have certain raw material shortages that will kind of fly in the face of some capitalist-aligned ideas of how to tackle climate change. And that then in turn raises questions about cognitive bandwidth and about economies of attention. If we widen the scope and understand climate change as one dimension of capitalism in the Anthropocene, and I was wondering, what your thoughts about climate change and capitalism in that wider context of the Anthropocene are, and whether that changes in any way the questions or the concerns or the hopes that you have that you just presented and talked about.
Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get to that, but let me let Malcolm get the final word, and then maybe if you guys want to stick around and have some conversations, some folks will stay here. But go ahead, Malcolm, do you want to have the last word?
Greetings from COVID land.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm not there. I hang out with philosophers, and one of their solutions to all of this is basically pay the bastards. So much as it stinks, maybe if the alternative is an unlivable planet, maybe we should just pay the ransom and basically pay for all the costs that will fall on people who we don't really care about, but who are standing in the way of a livable planet. And the second part of this is throw the bill onto future generations who, if we give them a livable planet, might have incomes far larger than ours and therefore could afford to pay the bill. So I just leave you with that. And I was kind of wondering what the panel might think of this, whether that sort of articulates in any way with your discussion of capitalism, but that's maybe too big to get into.
I think I'm going to let it go at that. Everybody, listen, thank you for coming. I wish we had a little more time. I apologize that our technical problem happened, but we got in the room 10 minutes late. Maybe we were 15 minutes late to begin with. But I want to thank our panels. I think we got the whole debate out here. And I think you can decide what you think. All right.